Now, the second thing that I think is really the most important thing in terms of the hierarchy of variables is is the exercise supported? I think that people make the mistake of like operating in open space in very unstable environments with their exercise selection. And that's not a great setup to be able to drive enough force into a muscle tissue. So, I operate with this concept that I refer to as ground, that I look at as like the most unifying concept of exercise science as I see it. So, I define ground as interacting with external support and interacting with things that provide neurological feedback. And I actually organize athletes according to a ground spectrum. So I kind of look at like low ground athletes that interact with very little ground on one end of the spectrum, which I would say like good examples are divers and half pipe skateboarders. And on the other end of the spectrum, athletes that are high ground would be like power lifters and interior linemen in football. When I look at what makes someone a great low ground athlete, I think that it's the ability to turn and tumble in space at high velocities. And when I look at what makes someone a great high ground athlete, it's the ability to prevent yourself from being turned and tumbled by external forces. And there's certain adaptations that make you better at being a great high ground athlete. And I think that's generally building more mass and more skeletal muscle tissue. And I think that there's certain adaptations that make you better at low ground athletics. And I think that that is having really great joint positioning and being able to have incredible motor control and ultimately increase your mechanics for what would make you be able a good turner and tumbler, which is a deeper conversation than what we want to get into here. So I think that you can also categorize exercise along this continuum as well. So, when I think about high ground exercises, if I'm talking about a squat pattern, for instance, an exercise that would have more external support and more feedback would be something like a hack squat or a pendulum squat. It's got a back pad, it's got hand holders, it's got handles that you would hold on to, it's got a foot plate, it's on a track, so it only moves along that line. It really is going to, what I think about from this perspective is the more ground that is inserted into an exercise, the higher the probability that the person is going to recruit and fatigue the target tissue for the motor pattern for that particular motor pattern. So if someone, like a very high ground squat is, like I said, a hack or a pendulum. A high ground squat would be something like a barbell squat. A moderate ground squat would be something like a split squat. A low ground squat would be something like, a split squat in the frontal plane. And then a very low ground squat would be some kind of a lateral stance frontal plane split squat. That's sort of the way that I categorize things. And the basically when I'm looking at the athlete, I put them on the ground spectrum for where I believe they reside. And then I ultimately try to match them with similar ground exercises as the majority of their training volume. And then they would receive some level of volume outside that exact slot for the remainder of their volume. But when I look at someone and I say, hey, I want to put as much tissue on you as possible, I generally go with very high and high ground choices. And I just stay in that wheelhouse and I don't really bother with the exercises in moderate to low ground. Basically, it's like you need to be able to anchor yourself with external support so that you can create more leverage with your joints to be able to drive things with more force. When you really get down to the concepts around utilizing resistance training to grow tissue, there's potentially a few signals that could be being sent to the DNA to initiate the protein synthesis concepts. Historically, we've talked about, tension and metabolites and other waste products and things like that. But it seems as though the only thing that's really remaining at this point is tension. It seems like metabolites don't really matter. pH doesn't matter too much. Heat doesn't matter that much. It's just purely tension. So when I'm trying to think of ways to establish exercises that can drive as much tension into a muscle as possible, the first thing that comes to my mind is it needs to be strongly externally supported so that I can really go in and hammer that particular muscle with a lot of force.